Hello and welcome to the very first episode of the Social Agtech podcast by dmtr. I'm Orion and I'm here with my co-host Dion. This is the place to be for those interested in shaping a more food-secure future for our planet where nobody has to go hungry. Whether looking to learn more about the issue, find out more about how you can be making a difference, or how you can support and learn from the innovators that have already started along the right path, we're going to be covering the topics for you.
Each episode will be taking a look at and breaking down the latest stories and developments from the world of food and agricultural technology, as well as checking out the amazing work of some of the latest startups and programs making a real difference in some of the most food insecure communities around the world. These first two episodes are going to be a bit different to all those that follow, as we explore some of the key challenges that cause hunger around the world, how we got here, and how DMTR and this podcast fit into efforts to achieve zero hunger.
So maybe before we dive into, well, all of that, why don't we start with some of the basics? And I guess it's obvious hunger and malnutrition is a bad thing. And I don't think we probably need to say much more than that. I feel like most people are aware. And ultimately, it's a massive problem for many, many people around the world. But I suppose it's sometimes difficult to put that into context. And I guess the question is, how exactly bad is it? And is it getting any better?
Sure, so I think we can answer that in broad contextual brushstrokes here, and I think importantly, the 20th century was the Green Revolution, so a time of massively increased industrial yield, and that, broadly speaking, meant that we saw a reduction in food insecurity, so more and more food availability on the planet. And we see that in 2000 to 2015. This is when we have quite clear data showing global progress, as well as global commitments to making that progress. However, since 2015, we do see stagnation and or reversal. This is reflected in a rise in undernourishment, particularly in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. At the root of this, it's complex, but there's increased conflicts globally, climate shocks, and indeed the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and associated restriction measures. The most drastic increases are seen since 2019. And conflict is still understood as the biggest driver of hunger, with 70% of the world's hungry people living in areas afflicted by war and violence. Just to throw some statistics in that hopefully color the situation, quite how severe it is, there are about 2.4 billion people who are moderately or severely food insecure in 2022, which is about 30% of the global population, of which about 900 million people are severely food insecure, which is about 11% of the global population. And in 2022, we see an estimated 148 million children under 5 who are stunted, which is quite shocking figures to ruminate on for a minute.
And remind me again, so stunted, so what exactly does that mean for a child when we say 22%, or I guess in real terms, 1 in 5 children around the world, and I guess in certain regions, in certain countries, that is even more concentrated, but globally 1 in 5 children are stunted. So what does that mean in terms of their growth and development?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think essentially it compares what was that child's potential growth, their optimal growth, and are they reaching that? So if a child is stunted, it might mean that they haven't grown as tall as they could have. They haven't been able to develop in other ways as they should have as well. So that could be vitamin deficiencies. It can be quite severe for that child's development. And I think it's really important to note here that can be a lifelong problem. That child has not been able to access the food and nutrition they needed to grow properly. And will likely face other issues in their life due to that, which becomes a global health issue as well.
So yeah, so that's 1 in 5 children stunted, and one in 10. So 1 in 10 people in every single room who are severely food insecure. Which I think when you put it into kind of those terms, you just realize how bad the problem is. And I think maybe on the more positive note, I mean, you started right by, I guess, saying, you mentioned like the green revolution, and that was kind of linked with a kind of good period of improvement and I think, and you correct me if I'm wrong, given you probably know more about it than I do, but I know that for certain areas in the world, particularly I think South America and probably South Asia, that was maybe more particularly successful than other areas, with Sub-Saharan Africa probably benefiting less from that period and probably being one of the areas we still see kind of more elevated levels of both kind of stunting in children and severe food insecurity. So it wasn't unfortunately, well, it kind of gives hope for some regions and showed kind of really good development in some regions. Others, unfortunately, didn't benefit in the same way. But it does give hope that with the right efforts and applying some of the same, I guess, thinking and kind of regional push to improve food production that came with that. I'm currently in Asia, so I know there was a big push for rice in Asia during the Green Revolution. But then, yeah, obviously, I mean, with COVID, again, that probably doesn't need much of an introduction. I think there was nothing else in papers for a couple of years, and the increase in conflicts and climate shocks are kind of hard to miss these days. And often one of the aftermath points of what it leaves behind with kind of damaged infrastructure, people that have been kind of pushed out of their homes and displaced, is that there just isn't that infrastructure to continue to feed those people, and we see that kind of increased level.
Totally. I mean, I think it's worth mentioning there that when we talk about the Green Revolution, that was, as we understood at the time, a solution to food insecurity, to rising populations globally. But I think also what is being revealed and has been known academically for quite some time, but is repeatedly revealed, is how food insecurity is not simply a problem of production, and increasing agricultural yields alone will not solve the food crisis. And when you talk about, I think, progress in certain regions of the world, it's also coming hand in hand with the Green Revolution are potentially short-sighted interventions too, such as monocropping, investing hugely into high calorific foods and high yield wheat production, etc., but that didn't necessarily take into account crop biodiversity, longevity of production, nutritional diversity, etc. So it's definitely a mixed bag.
And you've made it clear it's not a simple problem, right? I mean, you probably touched on just a few points there, and there's already so much to consider, and why it's such a challenge and in such a poor state. And I suppose maybe if we pause on kind of the crux of the issue, maybe switch gears slightly, given we've used quite a lot of different terms that may not necessarily be obvious exactly what everything means. I think particularly, and given we're going to probably use them plenty over this episode and in the future, I think things like hunger, food security, malnutrition, what do those all actually mean, and are they different, and how are they different?
Yeah, another great question, because I think, unfortunately, as you unpack these terms, you find a lot more complexity hidden just under the surface. But simply put, hunger is a feeling. It's a sensation of needing food and not being able to access food, and feeling your body's reaction to that. Malnutrition is a more medical term referring to not being able to hit your nutritional targets and being, as we spoke about, stunted, for example, otherwise deficient, and the health consequences that entails. Food security essentially talks about more so when one can expect their next meal, and if there is reasonable doubt that you are going to have a meal anytime soon. So it's more an expectation of hunger or a fear of hunger, which also has consequences and leads to a set of coping strategies that can be very problematic, because we could understand if you were worried about where your next meal might come from, you might take your child out of school and get them working instead. So there are a lot of social consequences that can come from food insecurity before hunger is actually reached. And I think it might be worth unpacking food security a little bit more, because as a concept, it's evolved into our current framework, and really has its roots in the 1948 UN Declaration of Human Rights through the right to food, and so this was supplemented by a negative obligation in the right to be free from hunger in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in 1966. So really we're talking about what is understood as a human right to be free from hunger. And in 1974, the World Food Conference, this was held by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization in response to the devastating Bangladeshi famine of 1974, the word or the concept of food security was first posited. And this is looking at stable and adequate supply of foods. And as we spoke about, the sense of food access becoming more and more important, not simply food production, emerges through the 80s and with Amartya Sen's work, as well as many others. So we landed on the current definition of food security in the 1996 World Food Summit. And I think we will be referring to food security a fair bit, so it's worth knowing the actual legal definition here. That is, food security exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food, which meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life.
So yeah, I think it's obviously incredibly important that, at least for food security, we understand the definition, given I've lost track of how many times we've already said it, and we've been about 10 minutes into this whole podcast series, and we'll say it endless amount of time since. And probably also important to, although it's minute, appreciate that slight difference, the term hunger, and then probably even more importantly, because we use it a lot as well, is the term malnutrition, which I'll let you explain and hand back to you.
Sure, malnutrition includes micronutrient deficiencies, and so it's also important to note that this could look like obesity, and in the case of a child that could be stunting, wasting, also obesity. So it can also be a little bit more discreet. It doesn't show up in a kind of conventional, necessarily what we might picture when we think of malnutrition, but these have, and I'll emphasize again, real world consequences, because an unhealthy population, for whatever reason, will not be at their optimal health, and that can have effects on their livelihoods, on healthcare systems, etc. So malnutrition is a global problem that has its roots in food insecurity, essentially.
And then, I suppose I didn't ask this, but we haven't mentioned these other words, but I suppose we're probably gonna come to them, and probably quite important to what we'll end up talking more and more about over the coming episodes, as we start looking at the broader, what we call agri-food system. As we look at innovation, a lot of that gets classed under a category of what is often referred to as agricultural technology, or agri-tech, or ag-tech. And I guess how those then ultimately connect back to our terms of hunger, malnutrition, food security. And then there's things like food sovereignty as well, which I appreciate is probably a slightly more political conceptualization. But coming back to kind of the likes of agri-food system and kind of ag tech, maybe Dion, I'll hand back to you, but where do those come from, and really what do those mean as well in the concept of what we're talking about and what is often talked about in this space?
I think it is really important to understand how holistic a food system is, or an agri-food system, and that this entails production, processing, food distribution, procurement, and consumer behavior. So if we remember the food security definition as well, when we talked about food preferences. It includes an element of food preferences, cultural relevance, consumer behavior, etc. And within the periphery parts of the food system, we're also talking about people's capacity to access those safe, nutritious, culturally relevant food preference choices. So the food system is a much wider conceptualization, and when we're talking about agri-food, I think we're talking about slightly smaller in terms of more the agricultural system itself. Agtech, on the other hand, is focusing more on the application of technology in agriculture with the aim of improving efficiency, productivity, and sustainability. Think mobile apps for market access to advanced technologies like precision farming, drones, AI, irrigation, etc. So, with all this in mind, let's come to dmtr. I'm going to ask you this because I think everyone is bustling to hear. What is dmtr all about, and how does this podcast fit in with its mission?
I feel like that was an inevitable question we'll probably have to answer at some stage. So it makes sense to kind of start with that, absolutely. So let me think about this. So maybe let's start just with the mission. And I'll quote this verbatim, and then we can probably cover what it actually means in the real world and actually in practice. But dmtr's mission is to help eradicate hunger by increasing innovation and the funding of solutions for both resilient food production and distribution. So that sentence, ultimately, what does that mean in practice? And for us, what that means is, one, raising awareness of the key causes of hunger and the effective as well as the not so effective ways that these are being tackled to achieve a food secure planet. Secondly, it's also supporting socially driven young entrepreneurs to develop solutions that are focused on reducing hunger, particularly in vulnerable communities. And then thirdly, it's supporting startups and programs to scale impactful solutions through connection to a network of experts, like-minded thinkers, and ultimately funding as well. So those are kind of the three ways we at the moment are looking to put that mission into practice. This podcast being one of them, and kind of falling into that first educational and raising awareness piece that we're hoping to achieve. And I guess with all of this for us, and we're relatively new to this and this conversation, although being engaged and learning about it for some time. And the reason for us for doing this now, and why we feel it's so important now and such the right time to be doing this sort of thing, is that we're really at a major turning point in our global agri-food system. There's that term, which encompasses, I mean, Dion, you covered it earlier, but it encompasses everything involved from the production to consumption as food and everything in between, the processing, etc. And the world has woken up to the impacts of climate change, and most importantly, how food and agriculture are central to this and that conversation and solving that for the kind of medium to long term. So as that climate conversation's evolved and become front and center of both governments as well as people, as a result of that, there's been an absolutely massive growth in particularly sustainable agricultural technology solutions or agtech solutions. But as people and companies are demanding more and more sustainable food and supply, it's become more and more important for the general public, particularly in the West. However, with many of these solutions, they're often too expensive and out of reach of those that are already struggling. And our concern is that, we risk creating a sustainable food system that leaves the people already struggling, it leaves them behind. So our focus is on an innovative solution that helps bridge exactly that gap and helps increase food production and access, specifically for those that suffer the most from food insecurity. And as I mentioned, where does this podcast come in? So with this podcast, we want to explore some of the main causes of severe malnutrition and food insecurity, look at new ideas and ways that are being explored to tackle them, and check out innovative solutions that are already making a difference and look at how others can ultimately do the same. So hopefully that was a brief-ish summary that made sense kind of around what we're looking to do with DMTR, and hopefully explains kind of where this podcast fits into that kind of overall picture.
That makes a lot of sense, and I'm curious then, what can listeners expect in the coming episodes?
So I think this, hopefully we've given a very brief intro, and I know we focused a bit in this episode kind of more on the problem, where kind of this podcast fits in and what we're overall with DMTR looking to achieve, and touched on some of the kind of basics around what a lot of the things we're saying means. I know you said at the start this is going to be a kind of two-part introduction. Kind of the next episode we'll look a bit more at our stories, how we ended up here, and some of the ways that we've seen that are most effective and things we've learnt in tackling hunger as a whole. But then kind of beyond that, as we kind of move into our kind of regular format, we'll be looking and focusing much more on the latest developments from the world of food and agricultural technology, whether that's new agri-tech, the high-tech stuff you touched on, from AI to drones. But I think most importantly, and a lot of the focus where we want to be kind of speaking to others in the field, speaking to startups, learning from their successes, seeing some of the inspirational work they're doing, as well as looking at kind of the cool new ways they've been innovating to actually help tackle the problem from both the high tech and also the low tech side, right? I think innovation doesn't have to be always using the new technology. Often, and we see it all over the place, where technology has been around for a long time, but out of reach from a lot of these vulnerable communities. And it's looking and innovating new ways that we take tech that may not be super modern and bringing those to those communities to make a difference in ways that they've not been able to access before. So that's what we're going to explore a couple of episodes down the line, and we'll keep going throughout the series.
And with that said, that's a wrap for our very first episode of the Social Agtech podcast by DMTR. We've covered a lot of ground today, discussing the gravity of global hunger and food insecurity, the complex terms that define the issue, and how DMTR and this podcast are contributing to the fight against these challenges. It's been an enlightening conversation, and we hope our listeners found it as informative and thought-provoking as we did. Remember, this is just the beginning of our journey together towards understanding the complexities of food insecurity and malnutrition. As mentioned, in the second of our introductory episodes, we'll dive a bit deeper into our personal experiences and the paths that led us here. We'll continue to share stories and takeaways from our past, giving you a more intimate look at the challenges we've encountered along the way. And of course, that will all set the stage for bringing the latest developments in ag tech. Before we sign off, we want to remind everyone to stay engaged and curious. Check out our website and social media channels for more resources and ways you can contribute to this important cause. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss out on any upcoming episodes. We'll see you in the next episode of the Social Agtech podcast.